Hey guys, this is BenCB for RaiseYourEdge.com, and today we will be talking about the collusion likelihood. And at first I'd like to explain what the collusion likelihood is. After that we look into mistakes that take place by virtue of the collusion likelihood. Then I show you the impact of it on our shoving range. I will explain you the concept of the future EV, and as the last point I will show you how you can adapt perfectly with the collusion likelihood and play your ranges perfectly. And of course we will look at many example hands. So what is the collusion likelihood? This is the likelihood of the remaining players getting all in against each other. So for the collusion likelihood we need at least 2 players behind. When we are on the bubble, on the button, and we fold, how probable is it that the small blind and the big blind go all in? Or how probable is it that the small blind shoves and the big blind calls? And this has a huge impact on our EV. As an example, when we have a maniac in the small blind and in the big blind and we are on the button, if we know that, we should shove very tight, cause it is very likely that the 2 donkeys go all in and bust each other, so we can fold us in the money. There's also the situation that we have 2 very tight players in the blinds. So we have a really tight fish in the small blind, and this happens very often on the bubble. And we have a tight or normal regular in the big blind. This situation occurs very often. In the situation we should be very loose, cause the small blind and the big blind will not tangle with each other too often, and this reduces the EV when we fold. And our EV goes up when we play aggressive from the button. I will show you later how this exactly looks like when we get to the example hands. We can say that a standard shove or a call is often not the correct play, so a standard push, in your opinion, will become minus EV very fast. And these spots look very standard to you in the first and in the second view. You just never took a closer look at it, so you make those mistakes over and over again, and you burn so much money with these mistakes. The same applies to your folds. There are situations in which you can play very loose from the button, but when you don't recognize these situations and you fold all the time, you will lose so much money. Let's move on to the typical mistakes. Many players have the leak that they play too loose on the button when they are mid stack or a big stack. I recognized it especially as a big stack, cause many players with a turbo history play this way, and it doesn't matter if they played 6 max or the full ring sit and goes, cause as a chip leader you play way looser in those tournaments, and many racks are way too loose in the 6 max hyper sit and goes when they are the chip leader. They don't look into the collusion likelihood, and they don't know how huge the impact on our EV is. When we are 3 players on the bubble and all players are regulars, we have to be very tight when we are a mid stack. We only look into situations from the button on the bubble, and we look in some four-handed situations, cause there are also spots in which the collusion likelihood is very important. Then many players are too tight from the button as a short stack. We'll take a closer look at it when we come to the example hands. This also happens why they misjudge the collusion likelihood, so they don't look at the small blind and ask what player type is in the small blind. Is he aggressive? Is he tight? Is he a fish? Will he jam a lot first in or not? And depending on this player, we should decide how loose we can push on the button. Pretty often players disregard the future EV, and many players can't estimate the future EV. So how high is the future EV when they shove in this spot? Some players heard something about future EV, so they know that sometimes it is useful to shove in minus EV spots. But the fewest people can really evaluate the situation. We look closer into this topic when we come to the example hands. Overall, we can say that most players shove only the Nash ranges on the bubble. Many of you are very familiar with the Nash ranges, so you don't know them from memory. But when you played a lot of sit and goes, you hopefully looked into some Nash ranges. But I think that's insufficient. It's not enough that you know what you can shove according to Nash, because nowadays you need to look at the collusion likelihood and at the future EV. You need to estimate the table dynamics correctly, and we can make some really sick adaptations to Nash. Every bubble has its peculiarities. We have different player types, different stack sizes. That's why Nash is a good foundation, what you should or should not shove. But in game, within seconds, you should try to adapt perfectly to the specific situation. Which player type is in the small blind, which player type is in the big blind. And you should construct your button ranges based on this. And we will look at this in detail later on. This is just the theory right now, that you have the background knowledge, and I think with the example hands it will be easier to understand if you don't know what's really going on right now, especially when you are not that experienced with ICM right now. Okay, now let's look at the impact of the collusion likelihood. It is important that you understand that Nash assumes perfect ranges. So when we look at Nash charts, Nash assumes that every player on the bubble plays perfect ranges. And that this is not the reality should be clear. When we are on the button and we have a decision if we should fold or if we should push, when we now look at the Nash range, we'll also see that the small blind will shove an optimal range and the big blind calls optimal range. When this would be the case, the games would not be beatable nowadays. So there should be some differences. And we should also deviate from our ranges. So when you just push the Nash ranges, you make somewhere a mistake, because this would mean that you think that the other players play optimal, and that's usually not the case. And that's why the Nash ranges are not perfect. We have to push looser or tighter in the different situations, and as you know, many fish or unknowns are shoving too tight. So when in the small blind is a fish, he will shove too tight in the small blind and he will call too tight also. That's a huge leak, and that's what makes the sit and goes so profitable. Even regulars make a lot of mistakes. Many regulars call too loose, but there are also a lot of regs which call way too tight, especially at the low and at the mid stakes. And this is the biggest difference to the high stakes, that they call way too tight. What does it mean for us now? This means that it makes sense to be very tight, cause the two other players will bust each other more often than Nash is telling us. When we are on the bubble with two other regulars, and let's say we all have 8 big blinds effective, and we fold the button, and I think you know it from your own tables, most regulars can push very loose in this spot. Sometimes even any two, although they shouldn't do it when we look at the Nash range. So we should be way tighter than Nash is telling us. There are situations in which we have to be very tight, and we will look into some example hands later on. So we should fold some hands that are in the Nash range, and we try to fold our way in the money. This may sound a little weird, but it is often useful to not shove the whole Nash range. Even when we are the chip leader, there are situations in which we should be tighter than Nash. I think many of you can't believe that we should jam tighter than Nash when we are the chip leader, but this situation occurs very often. Of course, we have also often the spot that we should jam way looser than Nash. Okay, now let's look at the future EV. Okay, I told you this earlier, you should have a solid knowledge about set and go poker. I will not tell you everything about the future EV. Future EV just tells you how much EV your stack is in the next hands. So we try to look a few hands into the future and base our decision on that. When we fold this hand, what will happen in the next hands? If we jam and everyone folds, how big is our stack after the jam? And what can we do better with the stack, or what is now possible with this stack size but wouldn't be possible when we just fold our hand? The best example is when we try to become the chip leader. We just try to look in the future and try to estimate our EV. So not only the EV of the present situation, but also the EV from our stack in the next hands. Okay, when are slightly minus EV pushes appropriate? One important spot is when we can overtake the chip lead. So a close minus EV push is often good when we can overtake the chip lead. And we try to avoid a folding war. Avoid folding war just means that we avoid the situation that there's one chip leader and we and another player are the mid stacks. Cause in this situation we have to play very tight ranges according to ICM, and then we have to hope that the other mid stack busts before us. We can't push too many hands against the big stack, and we can't call too many hands against the big stack, and the big stack jams all the time. We can call relatively loose against the other mid stack, but he's not that often first in, and of course we need a hand to call with against him. So our room to move is very limited, and when you review a sit and go and you were in the situation that you had the mid stack, then don't just analyze when you had a hand that you can call. So don't just look if the call was correct as a mid stack. Also look at the hands before that. How did I get into this mid stack situation? Was there a spot that I could avoid to become a mid stack? Maybe we even had the opportunity to become the chip leader. So analyze these hands in the calculator. You had a trash hand, but you could resteal cause the regular opens too loose and he folds too much against your rejam, and maybe the any2 rejam is profitable. So look at those spots. Oh, and I don't want to say that you should just barrel all the time to become the chip leader, but there are situations in which we should take a slightly minus EV jam, cause then we can abuse the bubble better and we can play loser ranges, and every hand has a higher EV after that. And that are situations in which our future EV is really high. Then we have the situation that we are the total short stack. In this spot we can also take minus EV spots. We want to keep our full equity alive. This is especially the case when we go through the blinds. When we are on the bubble and we sit on the button, in the next hand we are in the big blind. So keep this in mind. So when you lose your full equity in the next hand, you should stay on the gas. There's a exceptional situation when we are even with another short stack. So 2 short stacks on the bubble and 1 huge big stack, then we can't push too loose, cause now it is way more likely that he can bust before us, cause he has also a short stack. And we can fold the big blind when we both have 3 or 4 big blinds. We are not committed, cause he have to pay the big blind also, so we can wait till we have a hand, so we can't be ultra loose. Then I want to talk about a fallacy, and it is that big stacks call lighter. We try that when we push loose with 4 or 5 big blinds into stacks, that we can cripple or we can do a lot of damage to the stack. I think that's correct, but I don't think that big stacks are calling lighter. That's especially then the case when we talk about a regular. So when we talk about a fish, I see it the same way. We should avoid to push very loose against a big stack fish, but that's not the case when we talk about a regular. When you think about the situation, you have a huge stack and another rack shoves into you. You have no reads, he is just a solid regular, and he is shoving the Nash ranges. When you're unsure, you will usually fold, cause you have a very comfortable situation and you don't need to call ultralight. You don't need to risk your chip lead, and you have a lot better spots, and many regulars think the same way. Sure, when you know that this regular is very loose, you should make no folds that are a call according to Nash, but when you don't have the read that this regular is really loose, then many players skip the close call and fold. This means that the 4 or 5 big blind stack can push a loser, and I know that this is the case for a lot of regulars, cause they don't have to put their stack at risk. We shouldn't push tighter against big stacks as a short stack. Maybe as an adaptation, as an exploit, we can push loser as a short stack. That's an exploit against the regular player pool on all stakes. Of course, we can only do it till they call loser against us. So when we did a very loose push and got called, we should watch this opponent. If he starts to call loser or if he doesn't care at all, that's important when you pushed 8-4 suited from the cutoff with 5 big blinds and our opponent was in the big blind and he made a standard call. I think we should note this. And we should still push loose, cause so many racks don't care and they don't note things like that. When he calls you loser the next time, then you can assume that he has adapted. It is important that you take notes. I mean, on the lowest limits, it's not that important. That's not how you make money at the low stakes. So I would say from the $1 to $15 limit, it is not so relevant, but I would say from the $30 limit or even from the $15 limit, there are some good racks that are motivated and they grind a lot and try to move up in stakes. And sure, there are a lot of bad racks also, so there are a lot better racks than at the $7 limit. Pay attention to that and don't go too crazy. When I have a short stack, I try to analyze my situation and I try to answer the question if there is a better spot in the future. So often I know that this spot is minus EV, but I know that the probability that there is a better spot in the future is very low. I take the minus EV spot that other players would skip, cause I think that the next 2 hands will be even more minus EV. And you should try to answer that question, and we will look into some example hands later on as well. There are so many different opinions to the short stack play. Some players think you should be really loose and shove nearly any two, but I don't see it that way. I'm on the loser side also, and I try to take every good spot, but there are also players which don't want to take the minus EV spots. They think you should play according to ICM, but I think when you analyze the situation very rationally, then this is a good way. When you think that any 2 is profitable in the spot, cause we have rest equity and that the probability that he calls too tight is really high, then you should take the spot. Just try those things a little bit. Try to work a bit with the future game simulator from the Hold'em resource calculator and try to process all the relevant informations. When things don't work out, don't be scared. That's how you get better. Okay, that's it. Let's move on. Let's look at a few adaptations, and after that we look at a few example hands. So what impacts does this have on our button range? We look at bubble and four-handed spots now, cause when we are on the button and we are unsure if we should shove this hand or not, at first we look at the small blind. So which player type sits in the small blind? When there's a regular in the small blind, this tells you that he shoves first in loser, then a different player type, so in comparison to a fish. So the probability that the small blind and the big blind will go all in is higher than when a fish is in the small blind. Of course, the big blind is also important, but the small blind is more important because he plays the loser range. He pushes loser, then the big blind will call. So let's assume the small blind jams 63% and the big blind calls with a 20% range. As you can see, the small blind range is way wider, and this influences the collusion likelihood at most. When the big blind is also a regular, this means he will call loser than a fish, so the collusion likelihood is now even higher. For now, you should just try to understand the principle. This means for us, when we have a regular in the small blind, we should push tighter on the bubble or four-handed from the button than Nash suggests. When we have a fish or an unknown in the small blind, I would assume that the unknown is not that experienced with Nash ranges and that he shoves too tight in general. So we should just jam a hand we are unsure about, cause now the collusion likelihood is lower. You will see in the example hands that there are spots in which we have to be very tight, especially as a mid-stack on the bubble when we have two regulars behind. Many of you will now think, okay, when I'm only playing those ranges, then I always fold the button and I can't attack the chip lead. So what's our best adaptation? We try to implement a limping or min-raising strategy, even with 8, 9, 10, 11 big blinds. So with short stacks, the limping or min-raising strategy is a very good plan. But we take a closer look at those spots now. Let's start with the first situation. We don't want to talk about the specific hands, we want to analyze the situation for the button. We have the situation that we are 3 regulars on the table, and now we look what the button should jam. At first we look at the Nash range, so he can jam all those hands, and as you can see, the Nash range is relatively tight. That's because the regular in the small blind can jam any 2, and the big blind calls in 17.5% of the time. So the collusion likelihood for the small blind and the big blind is not that low. What's also important in the spot is that the button is not the super short stack with his 7 big blinds. We have 10 big blinds and the small blind has 12 big blinds. Now I want to show you what most players do wrong in this spot. I think most of you would shove ace-deuce offsuit all the time and hands like 9-8 suited, 8-7 suited, and most people don't know the EV of those hands when you look at this spot with realistic ranges. Let's look at the big blind calling range against the button. I don't want to argue which calling range is the best against the button. I just want to make it as close to the reality as possible, and there are many racks which call looser than Nash. I think this range is more realistic than Nash, cause the player in the big blind knows that the button is shoving a bit looser than Nash normally, cause with less than 7 big blinds he has to do something. When we think this calling range is realistic, you can see that some hands get really minus EV. Even a hand like deuces is minus EV. Of course, this is a little bit awkward situation, because in the next hand we are in the big blind, and that's why we should take some slightly minus EV spots. I made a future game simulation, as you can see up here, hand 2. So that's our standard Nash range. So we can push a bit looser, but when we now edit the calling range a bit and we let him call a bit looser, then this is our button range. As you can see, this range is really tight. So with the future game simulation, we can shove deuces, king jack offsuit plus, suited, king 9 suited plus, 10-9 suited plus. But even with the future game simulation, the offsuit aces are minus EV. So we should fold hands like ace-deuce and ace-3. We should also fold 7-6 suited, 8-7 suited, 9-7 suited, or king 9, queen 9, jack 9, 10-9 offsuit, and I see these hands very often. So even with 7 big blinds in the spot as the short stack, we can't push too loose, cause we aren't in a hopeless situation right now. We can shove a bit minus EV. I would shove king jack, king 10, queen 10, and jack 10 offsuit, and 9-8 suited, and I think king 8 suited to 9-8 suited too. When we look at the small blind range against the button shove, it's relatively tight. I would add ace-9 suited and king queen suited, and then it looks a bit better, especially with the king 8 suited hands. Now let's look into the situation when we have a fish and not a regular in the small blind. Let's give this player a 65% range. So we have a fish in the small blind and a regular in the big blind. When the regular knows that the big blind is a fish, he will call a bit tighter than Nash suggests, cause the reg knows that the small blind jams tighter than Nash. 89% of the regs will know that a fish jams too tight on the bubble, even as a chip leader. And now you can see the huge impact on our button range. I put in those ranges to clarify the spot. Let's assume that a fish jams 70%. I don't think a fish jams 90 or 100% in this spot, and we have to include that the fish in the small blind is a bit more call happy against our push, even when we have even if he has a huge stack. That's a disadvantage when they have a bigger stack, but then as a short or mid stack they call way too tight. And I think this range is realistic when we have a fish in the small blind. It's a sick range. If you should push the whole range in reality, that's a different topic, But when I know that a normal fish sits in the small blind, so no maniac that calls ace-deuce suited against our button push, I think it's reasonable to jam king-6 offsuit plus and queen-8 offsuit plus. So all hands with an EV of 0.1 or better, 8-7 offsuit, 4-5, 6-4 suited, and Jack-4 suited, and that's loser, then you would jam. When we have a very nitty fish in the small blind, so he calls way too tight with the second chip lead, and many fish do this, then we can push really loose. So when you have this scenario, then you can be really aggressive. As I told you, this is with the future game simulation. We are the short stack, and in the next hand we are in the big blind. We should fold the close spots, cause when they both are fish, they will give us more often a walk. And when we jam blind versus blind, they will call too tight. So we have a good future EV, cause they will make many mistakes in the future. That's the reason why we don't need to take every close spot. Even with 7 big blinds, we should remember that we have an edge, even that short. Let's move on to the next hand. We have aces in the small blind. But again, it's about the button. So what would we do when we are on the button? What range should we jam? I saw that the button made a really huge mistake, and when he does this mistake over and over again, he will burn a lot of money. So in this example you can see that a lot of players, even on the high stakes, have those problems. He pushed ace-deuce offsuit, and I want to show you how bad it is to shove a loose range in the spot. We have the situation that all players are regulars. Let's look at it in the calculator. What can we push according to ICM? We can see that ace-deuce offsuit is a break-even jam. When we analyze this spot, we should look at the calling ranges at first. And of course, they look different in the reality. Most people call loser, and I would also call loser, cause I know that the button will min raise hands like tens, jacks, queens, kings and aces, and I think I would call 8s plus and ace jack and ace 10 suited plus. I think many people also call 7s, that's why I included that hand in the range. If this is good or not is not the point right now. The big blind will also call loser, and we can see that it is a huge leak to push ace-deuce offsuit. It's very hard minus EV. Even with future EV, it is not plus EV. There's no advantage for him if he wins, because then he has 1350 chips. Even when he folds, he is still the chip leader. He should push really tight. Even a no-brainer push like deuces or pocket threes and the low suited aces are minus EV, or king jack offsuit or 10-9 suited, they are really minus EV. So we should only jam a tight range. When we limp and min raise a lot, we don't get a problem with balancing. We should only jam in an exceptional situation when both players are really tight. But that's not very often the case. There is a constellation in which we can jam loser. That's the case when the small blind is a fish. So let's look how our range changes when the small blind is a fish. We can assume that the fish jams tighter in the small blind. For 10 big blinds, I give him 45%. I would assume that he would jam more like 40% in reality. I think with a hand like 9-8 offsuit or queen 6 suited, he would rather limp or min raise. When a reg is in the big blind, he will know that and he will call tighter against the small blind jam. Even when a fish is in the big blind, he will also call tighter against the small blind push, because most fish are too tight on the bubble. So now the collusion likelihood is lower, and you can see that the button pushing range is way looser now. In the blind battle, we need to add one situation. They call too loose in the small blind versus a button jam. So they are not too tight in all bubble spots. A hand like ace-10 offsuit, ace-9 suited, king-queen, king-6 suited, or sometimes ace-8 suited is often in the calling range. With the second chip lead, they often call 2 or 3 hands more than a regular would do, cause they don't aware of the bubble factor. When we now calculate it, we jam a range of 37% and ace-deuce offsuit is profitable. It is marginal, but it's profitable, so beware of that. When 2 regulars are in the blinds, you have to be really tight, and with a fish in the small blind, you can jam loser. But even then, we should rather min-raise the low offsuit aces and jam the low pockets and the suited aces. We don't need to be perfectly balanced, cause we have a fish in the small blind. When the big blind is also a fish, we should min-raise a ton, and I would min-raise all hands under 0.125. I would even min-raise a hand like Jack-10 offsuit, cause I would assume that they don't rejam a lot. Sure, there are some loose fish. When you have a fish that was really aggro in the early game, then jam the hand. So when you have 2 fish in the blinds, it is better not to jam too many marginal hands. You should min-raise those hands. Now you maybe ask yourself, when should I min-raise and when should I limp? This depends on the big blind. When he's aggressive 3-better or 30-20 fish or 40-20 fish, then I like the limp more, cause they are more likely to 3-bet or rejam. When there's a 43 fish, I would rather min-raise. When you ask yourself why min-raise, he's always calling, but he's calling pre-flop, and then he check folds most flops on the bubble, so we steal the pot on the flop, and with the min-raise we produce more dead money, and 40-30 fish will rejam very often against the min-raise, but when we only limp, he knows we don't want to attack his big blind, we just want to play a flop. And when they are out of position, they often check the flop. Then we can attack the flop and we win the pot very often, and we need less chips for that. Of course, then we play sometimes 3-handed, but we have position, and this shouldn't be a problem to generate an edge, or at least the fish will make a lot of mistakes post-flop. This example should clarify that he is the chip leader, but he has to jam very tight, cause the collusion likelihood is the important factor in this situation, especially with 2 regulars behind. So the EV of his fold is very high when 2 regulars are in the blinds, and most players don't aware of that. They think they are the chip leader, they can be very aggro, and they think that ace-x is always a jam, low pockets are always a jam, and every Broadway is always a jam. Even with suited connectors, they think they have to apply pressure and use their chip lead, but often that's just a huge leak. There are spots in which you have to be very tight, even as the chip leader, and the 8 or 9% range. I mean, the ranges I made are all very realistic, so you just have to be very tight when you jam. Let's move on to the next hand. Right now, we are not on the bubble, but we talked earlier about the future EV. and we are right on the edge to lose our fold equity. We are not talking about the concrete hand. We look at the range we should jam in this spot, and I thought this spot was super interesting because even as a short stack we can generate a little bit more EV than the average rack will at your stake, or even at the higher stakes. This is the last hand in which we have full equity. When we go through the blinds, it will be super ugly. The next hand we are in the big blind, and even then we can't call that loose against the button, cause we are even against the other stack. So we have a high bubble factor against the button, and you should be aware of this. This is the last hand in which we have full equity, and we push into the best stack. When the button would be in the big blind, it is ugly, cause he has to call light, cause he's committed. The small blind should call relatively light, but it is possible, as I told you earlier, that he's calling a bit tighter, cause he is the chip leader and he don't want to put his stack at risk. Or when one player busts, then one player has 800 chips, he has 1500 chips, and one player has 400 chips. So that's a huge advantage. There's one super chip leader, one second chip lead, and one short stack, and he can abuse that really good, especially when the blinds are really high, so he can be very loose. We have a fish in the blinds, and he will not call that loose like a regular would. Let's look what we should push. At first just with ICM, and the second time with a future game simulation. In the future game simulation we can push 4% more hands, but we should push even looser in this spot. So let's look at the calling ranges at first. I don't think that the big blind will call that loose. I think hands like the suited queens and the weak offsuit kings, and hands like 10-9, queen and offsuit, or 10-7, jack-7 suited, he will fold those hands. I think 34% is reasonable. I think overall it will be a bit tighter, more like 32-33%. Let's look how this affects our cutoff range. Okay, there's not a huge difference, but that's logical cause we have the lowest bubble factor against the big blind. It is also important what the small blind ISO jams. I think it will be a bit tighter than this range suggests. Especially the worst hands he will fold. I think overall 18% ISO jam range sounds good to me. And the button, yeah, I don't think he's jamming tighter with his stack. And we can jam 37% now. And I think that's a good range to start with. As I told you, the situations will not get better. This is the last hand in which we have full equity. We push into a good stack we have the most full equity against. Just think rational in this spot. I don't think that we can use ICM that good in a spot like this, cause ICM doesn't take those factors into account. I would jam king 8, king 7, jack 9, 9 8, so all hands till minus 0.2 EV. So hands till queen 4 suited, 4 5 suited, 9 8 offsuit, maybe 10 8 offsuit, and king 6 offsuit as well. So our range is something around 45% in the end. It is better to be too loose than too tight. I can't justify it with mathematics, and there's no common opinion on those spots. There are a lot of different approaches in those spots, but for me it works very good in those short spots. So try to analyze the stacks within 1 or 2 seconds and look 1 or 2 hands in the future. Against which player type are we jamming? and then we jam around 40 and 50%. I think this is reasonable, because I already told you, I think it is unlikely that a better spot comes up in the next hands. It is likely that we get not a good hand in the big blind, but then we have to call light against the button and light against the small blind. But it is better to push with initiative from the cutoff. Yeah, the small blind ISO jams and the big blind calls. When he calls a hand like this, then he probably calls loser. This makes our jam a little bit worse in this concrete spot, but you can't know that. We got it in good and we hit a nice hand, but as I told you, we don't want to think results orientated. Let's move on to the next hand. I want to talk about this bubble spot. The situation is a bit different. We have one big stack, one mid stack, and one short stack. The blinds are higher and the average stack is lower. The button has around 7 big blinds, and we want to look what we can push when we are on the button as a mid stack. I chose this hand cause I thought that the button made a very good push. He shoved 6-5 suited. In the small blind is a fish. I don't know if he realized this. As you can see, 6-5 suited is not a Nash push, but it's already marginal. When he goes through the big blind, he loses a bit of equity. So when we take his position into account, what ICM doesn't do, then I think the push is break even. So with the future game, when we now look what the small blind jams with his stack, yes, I think this is reasonable for a fish, but with his stack, I think he will shove more like 55%. When I know that a fish is in the small blind, then I wouldn't call that loose in the spot, cause I can abuse the regular really good and I can skip this marginal spot. When I'm not sure if this is an aggressive fish, he played relatively solid in the early game, then I would fold the worse hands and I would call this range. And then you can see that 6-5 suited is a good push. When we adjusted the small blind and the big blind ranges, then you can see that the button can push really wide. I think the calling ranges are okay. The button can even push a bit looser cause he goes through the blinds in the next hands. That's the reason why he can push hands that are slightly minus EV. It is possible that the small blind calls loser against the button push, cause he's relatively short and maybe he thinks that he has to call. Now the 5-4 suited and the 6-5 suited push is break even. When we include the future EV, it's a good push. Okay, now let's change the situation. We now assume that a regular's in the small blind. Let's remember that we can push around 40% with the slightly minus EV hands. So now in the small blind is a regular. He will push very loose cause he is the short stack even against other racks, and I don't think that this is a bad idea, cause it is possible that the button calls a bit tighter, then he wants to abuse the bubble a bit. When I'm in the big blind, I would call relatively loose against the other regular, and when we look at the button range, we see that it is very tight now. Some rigs think that it's the last spot with full equity and they jam 80% range. Some shove any two. And then a pocket pair and even ace-deuce offsuit is minus EV. So the range decreases from 40 to 16%. We think that we can do some minus EV jams. Now we have a range of 20%, and I think that's really sick. It's so important that you recognize these situations, who's in the blinds, that you don't push the standard Nash ranges all the time. Okay, let's look at another hand, but I don't want to look at this hand in the calculator. This is maybe a task for you. We are on the button and we are one hand away to lose our full equity, like in the last hand. You can now think about if this is a good spot to push loose, and if this is a good spot to push king 5 offsuit. Would you jam lower offsuit kings? Look at the situation when the small blind is a fish and when the small blind is a regular, and then when the big blind is a fish and when the big blind is a regular. In this particular hand, the small blind was a fish and the big blind was a regular. Now think about the hands you want to push and then look at it in the calculator. And you can do it for the different stack sizes also. So give the small blind 8 big blinds and you have 5.5 big blinds. Just try a few different stack constellations for this spot. Then you can see how the ranges change. But try to estimate what hands you want to push and then look if you could estimate the situation correctly or not. And you can write those things down just as a quick exercise for you. Then you do it for the different player types. The small blind is a regular or he's a fish, and then look how the ranges change when you have 5, 6 big blinds and the small blind has 7, 8 big blinds. That's how you get a really good feeling for those spots. That's a really good method to work on your game. So don't only mark hands and look at them in the wizard or another ICM tool. Try to think about different stack sizes. Now I want to show you another hand, how it looks four-handed with the collusion likelihood. And of course it has an impact on our shoving ranges. We need to look at situations on the button or at the cutoff. So when we sit on the cutoff, it is important who sits on the button and who sits in the small blind. Because now two players can shove first in when we fold on the cutoff. But now we look at the situation on the button. We have a regular in the small blind and a fish in the big blind. And we look at it in the calculator. We can see that 7-5 suited is a close fold. And I think the regular will call 1 or 2 hands more. Yeah, I think that's alright. And then 7-5 suited is clear minus EV. The reg will shove at minimum the Nash range, but I think the fish will call a bit tighter. He will not call the Nash range, and that's not uncommon for a fish. And I think the regular is shoving loser when he knows that the big blind is a fish. Maybe the reg shoves any two. The fish has 7 to 8 big blinds, so he can fold and still play. That's why the regular can push so loose. The range doesn't change too much, and I folded this hand because I knew that the collusion likelihood in this spot is very high. I mean, when he jams 85% and he calls 35%, the collusion likelihood is really high. What happens when the small blind is a fish? I give him at first 60% range, and then let's see. So he's a loser fish. Now we can see that the EV goes up from minus 0.25 to minus 0.14, but I think in reality his range will be more like 40-50%, and even with his stack size he will limp some hands, and that's not a terrible play. I think the calling range is okay when we have the situation that the big blind is a regular. Then he will call a bit tighter, and then we have a close push. You should be aware of it. Four-handed, the range often changes by one hand. So with a reg in the small blind, we have to fold king 9 offsuit, and with a fish in the small blind, we can jam king 9 offsuit. And this applies to all king X, queen X, and jack X hands. with the fish we should jam 7-5 suited. We have 9 big blinds. Sure, we have enough big blinds to play with, but we should take the close spot. Another important point is that the big blind is maybe not calling that loose. Sure, some call looser with a hand like Jack-9 suited and others call tighter. I think this range is alright. There are fish which fold Ace-5 and Ace-6, so it's different. I think a 20% calling range against the button is reasonable. And I think the small blind calling range against the button is also reasonable. As you can see, with the fish in the small blind, we can jam 3 to 4% more range. It's not that sick like when we are on the bubble, but 3-4% are 3-4%. And nowadays, those spots are important. That's the modified hand for a fish in the small blind. And now let's look at it for the cutoff. According to Nash, he can jam 26%. So with the regular and the small blind, he can only jam 24.6%. And with the fish in the small blind, he can jam around 26%. So it's a little bit marginal, but it's about the hands you are unsure about. And long term, it's always a lot of money. So even four-handed, the collusion likelihood has an impact on our shoving ranges. And there are spots in which the collusion likelihood is higher four-handed. So the ranges change by 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, even 10%. That's the case when we are 2 even mid stacks, so our bubble factor is even higher. Let's assume we have 600 chips and the other two have 300 to 400 chips. Then it would have a higher impact on our shoving range, cause we can lose more. We have a comfortable situation and our bubble factor is higher, so the collusion likelihood has now a higher impact on our shoving range. And you can try this by your own. Play a bit with the stack sizes. We could review 100 hands with different stack sizes, and that's diligence that you look at it on your own. I hope the example hands helped you to understand the concept. The important thing is that you always look at the small blind and at the big blind when you have a close decision. But you should also look at them when you don't have a close decision. Many standard jams or standard folds from you are just wrong. Try to estimate how likely it is that someone busts before you. When it is probable that someone busts before us, we have to be a bit tighter. And when it is unlikely that someone busts before us, we have to be looser. So when the fish are really tight, you can push loser first in. When we talk about future EV, it is important that you don't lose your fold equity. When you are a short stack, always analyze the stack sizes. Try to push that you have fold equity against this stack. So try to push against the fish, cause they don't do the correct odds calls like regulars do. Or try to push against another chip lead regular, which makes the one or another tight fold, cause the situation is too good for him to take marginal situations. Can you become the chip leader with this push or with this min raise? This also has a high future EV. I hope you learned a lot. Try to implement this into your game. You have to work on it. And I hope that you had fun. And this was BenCB for RaiseYourEdge.com.